Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going to be taking a look at Chris Cornell and he's going to be performing Seasons. And this is an interesting video because it's almost like a rehearsal, a studio jam type thing. So we get to hear Chris's voice without a great deal of effect on it and a really stripped back sound. So let's have a little listen to this and see how Chris gets on.
Summer nights and long warm days, starlit as the old moon falls, and my mirror shows another face, another place to hide it all, another place to hide it all. Words I never find, and I'm left behind. The seasons roll on by, sleeping with a full moon blanket, sending flowers for been the answer. No dreams have never made my bed. Dreams have never made my bed. And I'm lost behind the words I never find. And I'm left behind. Seasons roll on by. Well, I wanna fly above the storm, but you can't grow feathers in the rain. And the naked forest call itself. Oh, the naked forest reminds me. Yeah, the naked forest reminds me that I'm lost behind the words I never find, and I'm left behind. Seasons roll on by.
I'm just going to jump in here. This was part of the soundtrack for the movie called Singles in the 90s. It's so hard to place because Chris was one of those guys that never aged. He always looked the same. He just changed his haircut. Also with this performance, it's that designated lead vocal, but everybody that has seen Chris Cornell knows that he can play acoustic guitar as well, and I've seen various performances of this particular track where Chris is playing fingerstyle and singing at the same time, so he certainly had the instrumental ability on guitar, but It's his voice that is standalone and was seen as arguably the best voice in rock and roll and so many different genres, but of course the whole grunge sound and movement that came along in the 90s, early 90s. But the thing was with grunge, it was such a serious departure from the 80s in terms of the lyrical content, and it's something that I've alluded to in other videos, how there wasn't particularly a real depth of writing, and grunge started to access that. And it was because guys like Chris were writing lyrically about things that hadn't been written before and things that they were experiencing. It wasn't one of these things where you have a songwriter who's imagining what it might be like to experience something and then put that into a song. These were guys who were writing about their own issues, their own emotions, and the difficulties in their lives. The thing is that when Soundgarden came along and Chris's vocal now got mainstream exposure, it wasn't as if the guys back in the 80s were listening to this grunge sound, especially with Chris, and thinking that it was rubbish and it was substandard, because Chris Cornell was seen in the industry, but not only in the industry, in the mainstream by the public, as having one of the best voices out there. And certainly there's a reason why Ronnie James Dio was a huge fan of Chris's vocals, and the praise doesn't really come from any higher place than Dio. And also Alice Cooper, who said that he was called the voice in the industry because of the nature of his ability vocally. It separated him from bands around at that time. It still separates him from bands around since because he had such a unique vocal quality, and the elements of his vocals, which we can see in this video, is a great example to delve into the vocal ability that Chris had, but the departments of his voice that he had total control over. He had the ability to not only lean into his vocal sound, but also take his foot off the gas so that he could achieve more of a storytelling quality to his vocal. When you're trying to explain Chris Cornell's voice and why it was so good, having a knowledge of the voice certainly helps. And you might have seen on YouTube vocal coaches talk about chest voice, head voice, falsetto, and these different types of voice going to different places within your vocal range. And some teachers will also say about making the voice one continuous voice, so you're going throughout your range all the way to your highest note to your lowest note without any breaks in there, so you can join up those registers effectively. And Chris had the ability to do that, but he also had the ability to flip up into a head voice and into a falsetto sound, or then belt in chest voice. I'm going to point out in this video where Chris does this, where he might be flipping up into a really connected, clean head sound, but then later on he'll be hitting those exact same notes in his chest voice with his belting register. So he can access the same notes with different parts of his voice, but of course it's all seamlessly woven together. In this particular performance, 2 minutes and 55 seconds, rewind it to there to really hear that in action, because he was singing in that range with a really clean, connected head voice sound, but then he throws it up there and belts it in chest. Chris always had the ability to add in that rasp, that effective vocal distortion whenever he wanted to, but could also lay off and hit a really clean head voice tone. Like we're getting here, such a connected sound of the vocal cords. He could also at any time put a little bit more air through those vocal cords to give it a more whispering quality. And this is the thing about top singers, and Chris again is a perfect example of being able to sing in exactly the same way that you would communicate with somebody when you're talking. So being able to sing almost like you're whispering, And then when you're telling a story, being able to get a connected sound, but not being aggressive with it. And then going all the way through to that raspy sound, an aggressive belting chest voice. You would have heard that referred to as the belting register, or just belting in general, taking that chest voice up into the head register, hitting high notes basically with a really thick tone. And that's generally what a lot of singers suffer with when they did that, especially in the 80s, and they didn't have proper vocal technique. They'd be belting out these really high notes and it would damage their vocal cords. When I'm mentioning about belting and forcing the voice, a great example, Chris Cornell. Look at him here. And the veins you can see on the side of his neck. But do not be distracted by looking at the veins on the side of his neck. It doesn't mean that he's forcing the sound. In fact, when he's low in his register, he would still get the veins that you could see in his neck, but there is no tension going on here. And you can hear it, the way that he's flipping up into that really clean head voice sound. He's not forcing the voice to go there, he's allowing it to go there. Let's talk about stylizations as well and general vocal technique, because it's one thing to have the ability to blend one register into the next and have a voice that goes all the way up and all the way down, and be able to put a little bit more air into the sound when you want to, and then having it more connected when you want to go for that sound. It's a whole nother thing to add vibrato to your vocal sound, to add trills, and have all these stylizations, blues lines that he throws in there, little throwaway lines at the end of vocal phrases. And his vibrato is so controlled. He's got such a cool, wide vibrato with his vocal that he can add in whenever he wants to, but also he can just sing it straight without any vibrato. As I said, this is such a great video to hone in on Chris's vocal ability because it's so stripped back. We get to hear it so clearly, and when we resume this video, we're going to be into a really connected head voice sound, so we can get an appreciation of Chris's use of that part of his voice, but how he uses it so effortlessly as well. But let's get back into this performance.
If I should be short on long things to say, would you come into my world and take me worlds away? Should I be beside myself? I'm not even stay. Ooh. Hey. And I'm lost behind the words I never find, and I'm left behind. The seasons roll on by, yeah.
And there we have it. That head voice section that I mentioned before we resumed the video, it was so effortless to hit those notes. And that's the thing about Chris's singing overall, that when he does hit those notes, you know that he can take his chest up there if he wants to and really lean into the sound. It really shows you how to do it in terms of singing and not pushing your voice too much, just controlling those notes seamlessly, blending the registers together. Another thing that Chris certainly would have done in order to be able to sing night after night, hour after hour after hour, with songs songs that do have these notes in there towards the top of the register, especially that chest register. If he's belting notes night after night, he certainly would have used a little bit of head voice in there in order to take the weight out of that sound, because that's what has done in so many singers over the years. He's got that option to take the weight out of it and save his voice for a whole tour. And there might be times where people hear Chris Cornell sing and he is going into that head voice rather than the chest voice. And that is a career move. It's not something that on a particular night you just aren't good at singing. He's a great singer, but in order to perform night after night, especially the amount of demand Chris Cornell was in throughout his career, he would have to have nights where he saved his voice a little bit. Some of the top singers over the years have been quoted as saying, when you are on tour, singing night after night for multiple hours, you have got to give your voice a good 75 to 80% of its capacity. They will take 20% off what they would typically do in the studio, because in the studio you can sing a song and have a rest between songs. Nowadays, singers might even have rests between vocal phrases, and just make sure they don't over push those vocals. If it is a heavier genre in terms of hard rock, heavy metal, they can do a little bit of a vocal and then come back to it once they've had a glass of water or a few minutes off to get that perfect vocal take in the studio. Live, you can't do that. You haven't got the luxury of taking a rest after every song because the crowd want to hear the next song. This is why particular singers sometimes fall by the wayside if they sing a genre that is particularly heavy on the vocal cords, because they always go for it and they don't have the vocal technique such as Chris Cornell, who can start to blend a little bit of that head voice in there, and more importantly, he could do it so that you wouldn't notice live. It's also why Chris Cornell in the studio was absolutely untouchable, because a fully fit Chris Cornell could hit notes that other guys just simply couldn't, and he could hit them, more importantly, with the meaning and the connection and the expression that other guys couldn't. This is the thing about artists that do have a life that is an open book. Through their music, they are dealing with all of these emotions and issues that they are putting into their lyrics of their songs, and it is a massive reason why, unfortunately, a lot of the grunge artists aren't around anymore, because they don't stop feeling these emotions when the gig stops. Once they've played the song, that isn't the end of the emotions that they were feeling when they wrote the song. So there are so many deep-set issues that a lot of the top artists around in the 90s were going through, and I know that there is a bit of controversy over Chris and the way that people had spoken to him before he died, saying that he wasn't sounding like himself and that security should keep an eye on him, and they didn't. It was only a couple of years ago, but there might have been some warning signs on that particular night. I'm not going to get into all of that tonight. There is so much depth of quality in his vocal delivery and his overall vocal ability, but just the vocal cords, the control he had of them was second to none. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!